Okay, here's the thing about President Garfield. Now, the Garfield assassination is not something that usually gets a lot of attention. It's probably the least flashy of the 4 presidential assassinations that happened in American history. And that makes sense. He wasn't killed on television. He wasn't killed by a political extremist. And he was really only president for about 6 months when he died in September of 1881. But wait. Whatever they're recommending to you to watch next, just hang on. This is actually very interesting because Garfield died at a very interesting crossroads of the United States in a lot of very interesting and peculiar ways. James Garfield's assassination came at a very peculiar crossroads of history for America, transitioning into the international global superpower that it is today, as well as the field of medical science. We'll learn that his assassination did not necessarily need to happen successfully, and that medical breakthroughs very soon after, or occurring while he was dying, could have saved his life. But, I know you guys. I know everybody who I've talked to about this video so far as I was preparing it. I know my wife, and I have a little bit of knowledge about the internet. So, obviously, we have to get the important thing out of the way. Yes, James Garfield does have remarkable similarities, especially in his name, to a famous lasagna-eating cat. And I know that this can be very striking. The 20th president of the United States and the comic cat that hates Mondays could be an easy mix-up, especially because Garfield died on a Monday. So before I delve into this little history lesson today, I have brought in the world's foremost expert on Garfield, Quentin from Quentin Reviews, to break down and have a strong idea of how you can identify who is Garfield, president, or Garfield, cat, from the comic books. Do they make Garfield comic books, or is it just a newspaper thing? I think I remember having a book order Garfield book when I was a kid, so it technically counts.
Hello everybody, I'm the Garfield man with the Garfield speech impediment that I hide with editing. So I was asked to come in and tell you guys about Garfield the cat, how he came about, and how you can tell the difference between Garfield the cat and Garfield the president. Here's where the confusion starts. James A. Garfield was elected into office during the presidential election of 1880, which he won in November of that year. By this point, it's fair to say that the president-elect had already made a substantial impact, and specifically on 2 Indiana farmers, who had a baby in October of 1880 and ended up naming him James Garfield Davis. In their defense, naming a baby after a politician was probably a lot less weird back then. James Garfield Davis eventually grew old enough to have a family of his own, and he had a son who he christened James William Davis, thus passing on the legacy of his first name without making his son a junior, technically. James Garfield Davis sadly passed away in 1951, sadly missing out on the birth of his grandson, James Robert Davis, who quickly took to the nickname Jim. The young Jim Davis often grew up hearing stories about this fabulous, cantankerous grandfather of his, and so, decades later, he decided to immortalize his grandfather by naming a comic strip character after him. And so it came to be that on the 100th anniversary of James A. Garfield's reign and death, his legacy became completely overshadowed by a cartoon orange tabby from Muncie. So, how do you go about telling Garfield the cat and Garfield the president apart? Well, it can be difficult, but there are a few telling factors. Garfield was born in an Italian restaurant and was most famously voiced by an Italian actor, meaning one could argue he has Italian heritage and Italian abandonment issues. Meanwhile, James A. Garfield reigned in America while anti-Italian sentiments were rampant, meaning that, implicitly, he probably never ate a lasagna out of fear of the political repercussions. Garfield became popular to mainstream audiences in 1981 when the earliest compilation books hit the market. James A. Garfield lost his popularity in 1881 by committing the poorly thought out political tactic of dying very slowly. Garfield lays around all the time because he's lazy and likes to sleep. James Garfield laid around all the time because doctors were erroneously trying to remove a bullet from his side, causing a severe infection which he slowly died from. And finally, Garfield hates Mondays. James A. Garfield died on a Monday. As a bonus side note, if the person you're studying is dressed up like a spider, that's probably Andrew Garfield, but not always. Alright, thanks for having me on. Good luck with the video!
Thank you, Quentin, for that explanation. Now, we have many other Garfields who could be mistaken for the president, like the Deals Warlock, but unfortunately, I just want to get right into the Garfield assassination. So, let's go. President James Garfield was getting ready to go on vacation on July 2nd, 1881. Congress was away for the summer, especially because Washington, D.C. was blazingly hot at this time of year, and the President of the United States, at this point in history, didn't have as much to do as he does today. This was a burgeoning time for American mass media, and so Garfield, one of America's celebrities, being the president and all, had his vacation plans reported in the newspaper. He went to the station in Washington, D.C. looking to go to Williams College, his alma mater, to do a small speech, and then it was vacation time. He was there with multiple people, two of his sons, his Secretary of State, and his Secretary of War, Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln. The people who did not come with him was a security detail because at this point in American history, the president didn't have one. Abraham Lincoln had a security detail, but that was because the Civil War was happening. In 1881, the president didn't feel like he was in any danger. As Garfield was entering into the station's waiting room, waiting for his train to arrive, a man by the name of Charles Guiteau shot him twice point blank in the back. And in a particularly Victorian fashion, apparently Garfield's words after being shot twice by somebody was, "My God, what is that?" And then he quickly collapsed because one bullet did graze his shoulder, but the second one hit him in the back. The bullet entered his back almost right by his spine. He got very lucky that it didn't hit his spine. And the bullet embedded just around his pancreas. I'm not an anatomist, but I'm guessing that the pancreas isn't generally this direction. Guiteau, the assassin, tried to make his way out, and he had a taxi that was waiting out in front of the station for him. We'll get to him in just a second. Garfield was carried up to the second floor of the station. He was conscious, but very obviously in shock. That bullet that lodged near his pancreas didn't come out when he was shot, and in that time, there was a strong idea that one of the most important things to do in this time was to get the bullet out as soon as possible. And that's where things started to go wrong. Also there, as I mentioned, was Robert Todd Lincoln, his Secretary of War, and son of other assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. So Robert Lincoln, in his life, had his father, who was president, assassinated, and then worked for two presidents who were also assassinated. Guy has had a rough life. Well, he was rich and famous, so, as rough a life as you can have in those circumstances, I guess. But who was Charles Guiteau? What could motivate somebody to assassinate a president who had only been in power for 6 months? You'll find out that the answers are extremely petty. Charles Guiteau seems to follow in the stride of many presidential assassins. He was a serial failure. He failed as a theologist. He failed as a bills collector. He even once tried to join the Oneida community and also failed at that. But then, like many people who are unable to function in human society, he went into politics, specifically Republican politics. And at this time, the Republican Party was in a almost hegemonic control of the United States. The Democrats not 100% recovered from the Civil War, this being only 16 years after the end of the Civil War. But specifically, there was a faction within the Republican Party that was trying to get Ulysses S. Grant to run for a third term as president. This faction that supported Grant had two major platforms that they believed in, and both speak just perfectly to understand radical Republicans of this time. One, they were very much in favor of advancing the civil rights of African Americans. to very much against civil service reform, which was basically an effort to actively get rid of the open corruption that was within American civil service at this point. So anti-racism, pro-corruption. Truly the centrist Dems of their day. Guiteau entered politics as a Grant supporter and wrote a speech called Grant Against Hancock, Hancock being the name of the Democratic nominee. But unfortunately for Guiteau, and Grant, I guess, he didn't win the nomination, and instead, the winner of the Republican nomination was James Garfield. Basically, he was chosen during the Republican National Convention because he was a good third-place candidate between Grant's stalwart faction and people who wanted to reform the civil service. Guiteau, sensing opportunity, decided to just do a little Control-F replace for his speech, Grant Against Hancock, and renamed it to Garfield Against Hancock. Garfield never delivered this speech in person, but they did print it on some leaflets that got sent out to a few hundred people. The response that came up in my research was that this was not well received because Guiteau's speech was just a really quick replacement of the name Grant with Garfield, and in many places in the speech, Garfield takes credit for a bunch of stuff that President Grant did. So even though this piece of writing by Guiteau did either nothing to hurt the Garfield campaign, Guiteau was convinced that he was instrumental in Garfield's victory over Hancock. And in that time, as we were talking about civil service, because of his contribution to Garfield's victory, Guiteau expected to get a nice civil service position, something that paid nice and didn't require a whole lot of work. Maybe something overseas. Apparently Guiteau was after a consulship in Vienna, but if he couldn't get Vienna, he was willing to settle for Paris. And old Charlie Guiteau had that hustle grind set, so when people told him no, he just refused to listen to them and just kept trying. Apparently, he spent an entire summer just loitering around Washington, going to people's offices, bugging people at the White House, just asking, "Where's my consulship?" And apparently, during this campaign, he was doing stuff like writing letters to politicians, using hotel stationery, and was getting less and less welcome in places like the White House or in different congressional offices because he didn't do things like change clothes during this 2-month period. Just also mention that Washington, D.C., even in the springtime, can be a fairly warm place. So this increasingly rejected and increasingly stinky Charles Guiteau just kept up that hustle grind set and kept harassing people and loitering in waiting rooms and all sorts of stuff until basically everybody in town had thrown him out. This campaign to get a consulship ended on May 13th when he was eventually banned from the White House's waiting room. So of course, without the cushy job that he felt he deserved, Guiteau did the next best thing. He determined to murder the president. He went to a relative of his and borrowed some money and used that money to buy a revolver. And I found so much fun information about this case because Guiteau apparently didn't really know all that much about guns. So when he went to go buy a gun, he just assumed that he was just going to need the biggest gun that he could get. So he was looking for the biggest caliber gun he could get his hands on. He went and got himself a British Bulldog revolver. And apparently he wanted to get it with an ivory handle because he knew that once he killed the president, this would end up in a museum, so that he wanted to get as nice of one as possible. Apparently he didn't have the money for this, but the owner of the gun store gave it to him anyway. We unfortunately can't verify whether or not this happened because his gun was lost by the Smithsonian, so we have no idea. The jury's still out on that one. Guiteau then spent the next few weeks doing two things: target practice and stalking the president. Apparently he directed a lot of his ire at James Blaine, who was Garfield's Secretary of State, who was the person who personally kicked Guiteau out of the White House and banned him, and basically said to never come back as long as he is serving here. So he wrote a letter to Garfield saying, "Fire Blaine or else I'm gonna kill you," basically. And this letter, along with all of the other letters Guiteau sent to the White House, were promptly thrown out the second they arrived. And there's new levels of delusions of grandeur involved with this as well. Guiteau reportedly wrote to William Tecumseh Sherman, who was basically the head commander of the US Army at this point, asking that he would be protected because there was going to be an angry mob after him after he killed the president. You know, maybe something that William Tecumseh Sherman would not approve of. And in these weeks, instead of being a jilted office seeker, he built this narrative in his head that he was going to kill the president so that he could stop the factionalism within the Republican Party and bring it all together once again. He apparently even went as far as going to the jail that he expected he was going to be taken to for a tour just so that he could get an idea of what was going to happen to him, but they turned him away. And that was the set of events that led that person to that train station on that July day. But here's the thing about Guiteau's assassination attempt. If it wasn't for the medical profession of his day, he actually might have failed at it. Apparently his shot wasn't that good and none of those bullet wounds were necessarily fatal. But luckily for him, the American medical profession hadn't quite caught on to cleaning things and sanitation. They were close. Basically, at this point, the idea of cleanliness and washing your hands and cleaning your instruments was going around. It was very big in Europe. A lot of younger doctors in America were trying to get people to clean their stuff, but a lot of middle to older doctors, and especially because in America, the medical profession was extremely unregulated. Many doctors ignored it, or they were against the idea. They didn't actually think that it worked or did anything. And that lack of sanitation paired beautifully like a wonderful rosé with the contemporary wisdom at the time for gunshot wounds that the bullet needed to be removed as soon as possible. So a bunch of people who did not wash their hands were just sticking their fingers in Garfield's wounds, trying to fumble around and grab the bullet somehow. Garfield was quickly whisked away to the White House, where people said that he was not going to survive the night, but miraculously, he did. By the next morning, his vitals had improved and he seemed to be on the mend. And this was a huge media event at one of the first times America really had a truly coast-to-coast, pretty fast mass media culture. Doctors had to post daily updates on how the president's health was doing. This was quite a phenomenon. Americans desperately checked the newspaper every morning to make sure the president was doing okay. And the drama lingered because he would do better for a while, then he would do worse. He would get these really nasty fevers that would then go away and then come back. He had a lot of trouble keeping down solid food, so he lived on an entirely liquid diet. But one of the things that those doctors didn't know at the time, but we do now, is that sort of waxing and waning of fevers is a sign that a very serious infection is starting to set in. These fevers got really bad, and this was all during the summer of 1881 in Washington, D.C., which is already a very hot city to be in the summer. And this was also a particularly hot summer, so he was in a really bad state. In fact, in order to sort of make him feel better, a bunch of Navy engineers came together to build what could essentially be called an early version of an air conditioner to cool down his room. The way that it worked is they rigged up a bunch of fans to blow over blocks of ice that would then blow that air into the room, which is clever. It works. It actually reduced the temperature of the room by about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, so success. The thing that did not improve his condition, though, is that the doctors continued to keep trying to find that bullet, sticking their dirty fingers into his wounds over and over again, trying to fish that bullet out. Especially because they became convinced that the bullet had lodged somewhere around his liver, not his pancreas, and so they were digging around there looking for things. Just imagine how painful that would be, because the best pain medication you had at this point was maybe like whiskey. So they're digging around in there, apparently at one point punctured his liver in their effort to dig out the bullet. I can only imagine what that would have been like for the president to endure. When they couldn't find the bullet, in an extremely Victorian turn of events, they called in Alexander Graham Bell to basically put together a primitive metal detector to find it. And Bell was not successful in finding the bullet, not because the machine didn't work. It actually did work, but there were two things that sort of got in the way. One, Garfield's doctor, Willard Bliss, who quite a piece of work, we'll talk about him in just a second, only let him use it on the right side of Garfield's body, which was distinctly not where the bullet was, but that's just where they thought it was. The second thing is that Garfield's bed was made of metal, which made the readings of the machine go all off, basically. So let's talk a little bit about Willard Bliss. Willard Bliss was a Civil War era doctor who was close with Garfield, and was brought in over his official physician, a guy by the name of Jedediah Baxter. And Bliss's main focus was that they needed to get the bullet out. Unfortunately, him and the other physicians working with him were utterly convinced that the path of the bullet was one way, but it very much wasn't. So they started sticking their fingers and poking and prodding around the wound, going in a direction that was completely not where the bullet was. But what they did do was make a whole lot of new holes in Garfield's body that could have been filled with pus and infection later. There was also a lot of drama over how to treat Garfield because at this point, sanitation was a controversial thing in medicine. There were some doctors who were pushing for him to be more cleanly, and he capitulated somewhat. There was also this big debate between what was called heroic and homeopathic medicine. Heroic medicine was the prevailing idea at this point. It was basically what the AMA was pushing. The reason it's called heroic medicine is because the types of treatments were really extreme. This was stuff like bloodletting. This was leeches and all sorts of really intense medicines and things like mustard spreads and stuff like that. Just really intense, really painful, strong interceptions that took a lot of fortitude and constitution to get through. The other side that was becoming more and more prevalent were homeopaths. Homeopaths, as is the pseudoscience of today, took the idea that actually less is more when it comes to medical interventions, and that if you take a medicine that you want to use on somebody and very heavily dilute it, you actually would get more of an effect the way you want. So essentially this is a conflict between two sides that are both extremely wrong on how biology works. Furthermore, Bliss actually did not like homeopaths very much at all, which, I get, but also he was really against this newfangled idea of cleanliness and sanitation. He thought that Lister of Listerine fame was full of shit, and that he just, wanted to keep doing things the way that he did it because, he was an old guy, old-fashioned, and would do things the old way. And that went about as well as you'd expect. Willard Bliss also started to raise controversy on his own because he started to become very demanding and controlling over the president. He wouldn't let him do any meetings. He wouldn't let him see his cabinet. He didn't want to get him upset in any meaningful way. So he basically locked off the president's access to other people. He had complete control over every single treatment he got, even as he was getting worse, and kind of resisted attempts to try new things. And as this became a media circus, he then became a character in the drama over the medical treatment of Garfield. And as a result of Bliss's medical interventions, he started to get an infection. The infection started to get worse over time, and as these infections started to ravage President Garfield's body, his heart started to get weaker and weaker. The president remained bedridden. He was in extreme amounts of pain, either from the infection or the people digging their fingers into his infected wound over and over again. Over the summer, Garfield went from 210 to 130 pounds because he was unable to keep food down and just had to basically eat broth to survive. The president became so emaciated that they had to resort to giving him nutrient enemas in order to give him some calories. Now this is going to get a little gross for a minute, so skip to this if you want to get around talking of gross things. The president's infection started to really set in. He started to experience sepsis, which was causing things like hallucinations. Also, the wound was starting to fill with pus. It started channeling and pooling in different parts of his body. Doctors at that point were actually encouraged by this because, unlike today, in that time, pus was seen as a sign of healing. And as we know today, that's a sign of massive infection. And if you have so much pus showing up in your body that it's pooling in different parts of your body, you could imagine that things aren't good in there. Yeah. On September 6th, to get away from the heat, Garfield was taken to the darkest of all places you want to go when you're not feeling well, the Jersey Shore, and taken to a nice little house. In order to get him there and get all his things there, they even built a spoke line of the railroad so the train could go right to his house. There was also an idea in medicine that quiet and fresh air would actually help his recovery. So they propped him up in a bed with a view out of the ocean so that he could have this nice, peaceful thing, because then they thought, if he was at peace, that his body could recover easier. So now I just get into a section marked death. The president started to get more infections, and as his heart got weaker, he started to have spasms of angina. He already had sepsis that just continued to get worse, He then started developing bronchial pneumonia, which is a really bad infection in the lungs. And eventually the infection defeated him. He died of a ruptured artery on September 19th, 1881. And then they did his autopsy, where they found that his body was filled with infection and that they were nowhere close to where the bullet was. Furthermore, both of his lungs had advanced pneumonia. Now, this is the prevailing idea of why he died, the infection caused by the bullet wound, but there's some people who think that that's not how he died. Because he died of what's called a pseudoaneurysm, in 2013, one medical paper postulated that it's possible that that part of the infection actually didn't kill him, and what caused the aneurysm was a secondary effect that was brought upon by inflammation of his gallbladder. So basically, when they did Garfield's autopsy, they found that his gallbladder had indeed ruptured. And according to the paper, the speculation is that this led to bile basically pouring into his system, which created abscesses that led to the aneurysm. Because the infection that was brought about by the bullet didn't seem to really cause a stark decline in his health, but then starting at around July 23rd, his health started to take a noticeable downward spiral, and they think that that was the point when his gallbladder ruptured. But yeah, due to one angry office seeker and a cadre of inept doctors, President Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, was dead. And America freaked out. It's been so long since Garfield's death that we don't really know much about it, but his death was a huge event in the United States. People freaked out. Apparently, even more so than when Lincoln died. The train that took him to that mansion on the Jersey Shore where he died left with a track covered in flowers from mourners who came to pay homage to the fallen president. As the train went by people's houses, they were adorned with American flags, hanging low in mourning. Moved by the death of the president, Marine band leader John Sousa wrote a book called In Memoriam, which was then played upon Garfield's arrival in DC. I'm just going to play you guys a clip from that right now. After arriving in DC, Garfield's body was put in the Capitol Rotunda, where he laid in state. And apparently, between this point and when his body was shipped off to Cleveland, Ohio for his funeral, 70,000 people came to see him. Some visitors waited over 3 hours, which, given the recent death of the Queen, the stories of the queue and people waiting days to see her lying in state, you can kind of get an idea of what the national mood was in the United States. When Garfield's casket arrived in Cleveland on September 25th, it was paraded down the streets. Many people came, high-profile people, to pay respect, including former presidents like President Grant and President Hayes, as well as several leading generals in the U.S. military, including William Tecumseh Sherman. They played Sousa's March again, and reportedly over 150,000 people attended, which was more than the population of the city. His body was then temporarily interred in a crypt until they could build him his own permanent memorial. Speaking of memorials, they popped up around the world. There was a commemorative stamp, there were monuments all over the place, including San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. The most peculiar of the memorials to President Garfield I found was that the Australians renamed a river called Cannibal Creek to Garfield in his memory. And then there was another ceremony several years later, this time in 1890, when he was taken from the temporary crypt and put in a permanent memorial in the cemetery, where he now rests to this day. And of course, as this all happened, we also had to deal with the new president, Chester A. Arthur, who was in New York at the time and found out via telegram. He was very swiftly sworn in as the president on the morning of September 20th and paid respects to Mrs. Garfield before going off to suddenly be president. But then, what happened to Charles Guiteau? What was his fate? When Guiteau tried to escape the station, he was quickly arrested by a police officer by the name of Patrick Kearney, who was reportedly so excited that he had arrested a presidential assassin that he forgot to confiscate his gun until they got to the police station. When asked on the scene why he did it, he said that he wants Arthur to be president, that he is the stalwart of the stalwarts, that he is going to bring an end to the division within the Republican Party. This theatrical response to the death of the president would become endemic of Charles Guiteau's next few months. But his unabashed love of the new president, Arthur, led to some suspicion that Arthur actually orchestrated the assassination, but that didn't last very long. So as November came along, Guiteau then went to trial where he was represented by his brother-in-law. The trial was understandably a complete shit show. Apparently, he really enjoyed the media circus that came up around it, and he did a lot of wacky things like asking random people in the stands for legal advice. He was constantly insulting his defense. He would go to the stand and give testimonies in the form of epic poetry, which he would just recite at length. And his main defense was that he was not guilty of murdering the president because he was commanded by God to do it, and that he was the only person who could be his instrument. After which he then started singing John Brown's Body to the court. He loved the media attention so much that he apparently dictated an entire autobiography that he sent to the New York Herald, and even took out a classified ad looking for a, quote, nice Christian lady under 30. Gross. He also tried to defend himself by claiming, not incorrectly, that he wasn't the one who did the killing, it was the medical malpractice that actually caused it. And this is where a very interesting part of Guiteau's trial comes to light, because Guiteau's trial was actually one of the first high-profile cases in American history of someone trying to use the insanity defense. The idea behind the insanity defense is that someone could not be considered guilty of the crime because they were not mentally capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. In 1875, reportedly his family was so concerned about his mental health, they actually tried to have him institutionalized, but he actually escaped. And, all the stuff about saying that he was commanded by God to kill the president, we don't know how sincere that was, but it was something he said. There is some people who suspect that he might have had bipolar disorder and he was experiencing a manic episode when he killed the president. He was apparently oblivious to the fact that everybody hated him, and he was suspecting that after the trial was over, he was found not guilty, that he was actually going to do a lecture circuit and things like that. He was even contemplating running for president in 1884. This is despite the fact that there had already been 2 attempts to kill him while he was in custody. So this defense was not very good at convincing everybody, and especially the jury. On January 25th, 1882, he was found guilty of murder of the president and was sentenced to execution. They kept him in St. Elizabeth's Hospital up until the day of his execution, during which he tried several appeals to stall the execution, but none of them went through, obviously. And on June 30th, 1882, 2 days before the anniversary of the shooting, he was hanged. Keeping up with Guiteau's strange showmanship, he reportedly danced his way up to the gallows and shook hands with the executioner, reportedly made a deal with him so that he could recite a poem he had written called I Am Going to the Lordy as his last words. He apparently requested an orchestra be present to play him out, but was denied that request. Curious about the mind of someone like that, part of his brain was actually taken out and preserved, and you can go and see it today in Philadelphia if you ever go to the Mutter Museum, which is sort of a very interesting museum of medical artifacts. It's in my top 5 museums in the United States that I haven't been to yet, but I really want to check out. Another part of his brain is also being held in the National Museum of Health and Medicine, along with some of the backbone and ribs of President Garfield, in case that's a thing you want to see. So that was the assassination of President Garfield, but I'd be remiss to not go into some of the effects that his assassination had on the United States, because they were large, although they refer to things that feel a little dated to us in 2022. In 1883, his assassination was responsible for passing the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, because being assassinated by a person who was seeking office led to people thinking, maybe civil service jobs should be chosen by merit and not political favors for helping people in elections. It could close a lot of doors that were basically open to rampant corruption. Because, maybe it wouldn't be good to have a sort of spoil system where people who were involved in the campaign or people who just paid for it could get jobs like being the ambassador to France or something like that. So because of that, a lot of jobs in the government got replaced with political appointments to essentially jobs you apply for like you would apply for any other job. Something that's notable to bring up at this point, though, is that Donald Trump, who has speculated about what kind of things he'd like to pass if he got a second term, theoretically, if he pulls a Grover Cleveland on us, One of them would be to essentially repeal this act and replace a lot of federal government jobs, specifically with a new class that would be political appointments. Specifically because Donald Trump, not a really big fan of democracy overall, wants to get rid of a lot of these positions and replace them with basically people who are personally loyal to the president. You know, it's a real dictator move, I gotta say. As for the fate of the new president made after Garfield's assassination, he actually would go on to lose the Republican nomination in 1884 to Garfield's Secretary of State, who then go on to lose the election to the Democrats, specifically Grover Cleveland, the guy I mentioned earlier. And if you want to visit the place where Garfield was shot, unfortunately the station has been shut down. It has been demolished and replaced. It's now part of the National Gallery of Art. But the place where he was shot in the Gallery of Art is still memorialized with a plaque. Nearby, there is also a Garfield memorial that you can check out. In case you're ever in the DC area and you want to do a little bit of presidential assassination tourism, I guess. Thanks, National Park Service. So next I'm going to be doing a section on what would have happened if Garfield had been shot the exact same place, the exact same way, but in 1981. And you can see that section on my streaming platform, Nebula. Nebula is a site where my creator friends and I all got together to make a platform that is free from the restraints that come from demonetization, from the algorithm and stuff like that, and let us experiment and create on our own terms. And therefore, we can invest in and make stuff that you might not see on YouTube. One big example that comes up in these kinds of situations is that YouTube, because of the way the recommendation algorithm works, really pigeonholes you into very specific niches. I know because if I ever make a video that's not on a dark part of history, it tanks. But if you want to see creators branch out and try new things, it's a really great place to do so. A couple of examples. Tom Scott made a game show called Money, which sort of plays with the principles of game theory, and there's some really great people on it. Wendover Productions is in it, and Mia Mulder plays a reality show villain on it, which is really great. Another example would be is that Abigail Thorne of PhilosophyTube made a making of documentary for PhilosophyTube videos, and it is extremely informative, and there's some really, really interesting gems in that I really recommend you check out. Now, if that all sounds nice to you, I've got something for you, because I have an in with Nebula as a member of it myself. And if you go to the link in the description and sign up for Nebula, you can get a discount on me, because I'm a nice guy. You can get it for as little as $3 a month or $30 a year. It's a really good deal. So again, check the description or the pinned comment on this video. Sign up for Nebula. You won't regret it. You're going to see a lot of really great stuff on there, and it helps me and the other creators immensely. So a lot did change as a result of Garfield's assassination, but notably there were a lot of lessons that were just not learned for some reason. One of the things that Congress decided not to deal with as a result of this is what to do if the president is alive but incapacitated. You would think that this would prompt this. One of the first major cases where the president was unable to do presidenting but was still alive. So 38 years later, when President Woodrow Wilson had a stroke in office and was basically bedridden and almost incapable for the rest of his presidency, they finally had to put things in place to make a line of succession and stuff to make sure that, you know, the country could just kind of keep chugging along if the president is incapacitated. Eventually, that would be ratified into the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which was ratified in 1967. The other thing that is interesting is that this assassination did not, for some reason, prompt a security detail for the president. In fact, the Secret Service, the current security detail for the president, wouldn't be drafted into service until after the assassination of William McKinley 20 years later. The Secret Service actually started as an organization that was supposed to catch people who were doing counterfeit operations, but then they decided to do counterfeit operations and presidential security, and now that's pretty much the main thrust of what they do. But they kept getting into trouble because McKinley and Garfield, both as presidents, wanted to be men of the people, and so they sort of brushed away security to sort of be close and, you know, glad hand and, you know, shake hands with average folks. But, you know, that did not turn out well for Garfield, and it did not turn out well for McKinley, and you can find out all about that watching this. Blah, 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 blah.